So in life, sometimes we struggle with choices and accomplishing goals, and we often believe that sheer willpower will get us there. But much of what we believe and know about willpower could actually be wrong. Or that's what Kelly discovered in working with students at Stanford University, where she teaches at Stanford University School of Medicine and the Stanford Center for Compassion. So she created a course called The Science of Willpower at Stanford School of Continuing Studies, and it became one of the most popular courses at the school, and went on to become a hugely successful blog at Psychology Today, and now a book, which you can get your hands on at the end of this talk. And Kelly says if she has her way, it'll soon be an action figure and an action movie too.
Willpower! Great.
So today Kelly's going to talk about how we can accomplish the array of goals that we often struggle to get done. It might be a healthier lifestyle, it might be a life of greater productivity, or sometimes something as simple as having waited for 6 months, finally clearing out the closet. So please help me welcome Kelly McGonigal.
Thank you. Hello. Well, I've been giving a lot of talks this last month and a lot about New Year's resolutions. I have to say, this is the first place I've talked where there was apparently a healthy code resolution going on. Is that right? Did I see these signs right? So who's still keeping their healthy code resolution? Anyone? Good. Congratulations. You've got some willpower. Why don't you tell me, just sort of get things rolling, tell me something that has challenged your willpower today. Anyone?
Getting up on time.
Getting up on time. Washing the dishes. Okay, so we've got two kind of I willpower challenges, something you have to make yourself do, even though it'd be a little bit easier just not do it. Something else. Yeah.
Doing yoga for back pain.
Doing yoga for back pain. Well, I'm glad to hear that. Were you at my talk 2 years ago about yoga for pain? That's great. Yeah, another I will challenge. Something else, yeah. Yeah, so an example of I won't power, there are all these links you could follow. You could just click and get lost down the link hole. And you have to find the ability to resist that temptation. Maybe one or two more? Anything? Back row, any willpower challenges? How about lunch options for today? Yeah, have you had your lunch yet? Or you? So, great, yeah, so we make lots of decisions every day about what to eat and what to do. Okay, well, these are all great examples of willpower challenges. And I want to just start with a little definition, my definition of willpower or willpower challenge. And I define a willpower challenge as something that is basically a competition between two parts of yourself. Neuroscientists are famous for saying that even though we have one brain, we actually have two minds. And we are completely different people depending on which mind is active or which systems of the brain are more active. And so a willpower challenge is anything where those two versions of yourself have competing goals. So, for example, there may be part of you that really wants to eat a candy bar for your snack, and then there's a part of you that actually has some longer-term goals. You're thinking health, you're thinking weight loss, you're thinking bikini season, whatever, and maybe the banana seems like the better snack. And again, both of these choices you might be drawn to by different parts of your mind or two different versions of yourself. And one of the things that has really influenced my work with willpower is thinking about it in terms of what's going on in the brain. And we're going to talk about that a little bit today. The fact that you could be the very same person, but depending on your mindset, depending on your energy, depending on your stress levels, your brain is going to meet this willpower challenge in a different way, and you're going to end up making, one choice today and one choice tomorrow. As mentioned, this book is based on a class that I teach at Stanford called The Science of Willpower. Those are our actual students. I'm not sure what I said that was funny, but those are actual Science of Willpower students. And I created this course because I was going around trying to teach people how to be more productive, how to improve their health. And everywhere I went, people said, oh, we know we're supposed to do that stuff already. We just don't want to do it. And there was this really interesting fundamental gap between what people wanted and what they thought they wanted. That is, people were very identified, you could say, with this version of the self. People felt like deep down they were the person who wanted the candy bar. And this other person who wanted the banana, like, who is that? That's not really me. And I realized that people didn't just need to know what is the right thing to do or the healthy thing to do or tips for stress management and productivity. They needed to feel like this person, and they needed to know how to be that person as the default rather than walking around always feeling like they had to resist this core self that only wants immediate gratification or never wants to do anything difficult. Okay, so that's how the class came about. Why is this clicker? There we go. Okay, great. So I thought today, since this is a class based on science, that I would share with you 5 of my favorite experiments from the class and from the book. And I chose experiments that I like because they use tiny interventions, really, really small interventions to shape people's behavior. And they have very large outcomes. And I think this is the kind of thing many of us are looking for. One small change we can make, whether it's a change in how we think or change in the way that we're approaching a willpower challenge, that can have huge payoffs down the road, making it easier to do what it is we really deep down want, even when it's sometimes difficult or part of us doesn't want. Okay, so let's start with the first experiment. How many of you guys sometimes feel like this guy? I know at least one of you only had 3 hours of sleep last night. Yeah. So it turns out that when you're this version of yourself, every willpower challenge is more difficult. And the first intervention that I want to tell you about is actually a sleep intervention. The main intervention was trying to help people sleep more or sleep better. And it was people who had a very serious willpower challenge. These are people who were recovering from addiction to drugs, and they were in a substance abuse recovery program. And half of the people in the standard care were assigned to take a mindfulness meditation training that was designed to help them improve their sleep or sleep more. And so the first thing I want you to take a look at on this graph, this is minutes of sleep per night. And you're going to think this is insanely optimistic, I know. But everyone's starting around 7 hours. And we're going to improve on 7 hours. And that probably seems an impossible dream. Okay, so everyone in the group was starting around 7 hours. And what the researchers found was that just doing a little bit of meditation every day, breath-focused meditation, increased sleep time to just over 8 hours a day. And the control group had a little bit of deterioration to slightly less than 7 hours of sleep a night. Okay, now that's not the interesting finding. I mean, it is nice to know that if you meditate for a few minutes a day, you will sleep better and get more sleep. But what's interesting is how that change in sleep time then made these recovering addicts impervious to relapse. They were stronger against relapse. And this is a very high correlation, 0.70. The increase in sleep time predicted resistance to relapse with a correlation of 0.70. Getting 1 more hour of sleep a night suddenly made it a lot easier for these recovering addicts to resist the temptation of falling off the wagon. And interestingly, the number, I never know, it's going to bounce off the screen, right? I should point at the screen. You guys are tech experts. The number of minutes per day that people meditated also predicted resistance to relapse. So there were really 2 things going on in this intervention. There was getting more sleep, and there was also something about the actual practice time. And it wasn't a lot, but it was something like 10 minutes a day, 15 minutes a day. And both of these things, sleep and meditation, were giving people more willpower for one of the biggest willpower challenges. So I want us to think together a little bit about why those 2 small interventions, an hour more sleep or 10 minutes of meditation a day, might actually give us more willpower for any willpower challenge. What you're looking at here is an image from an fMRI study of what happens to the brain when you're a little bit sleep deprived. And most studies use less than 6 hours of sleep a night as sleep deprived, which may seem normal to you, but for most of us, that's actually functioning far suboptimal. What you're looking at here is a composite of a lot of different people's brains, some who are sleep deprived and some who are not. And we're going to slice the brain. So imagine me standing this way, and we're going to have one of those like meat slicers, and we're going to slice down the head and just start taking sections off and look down the middle. And so where you see these yellow spots, that's the front of the brain right about here or right about here. If that were my brain pointing that way. And yellow means that this area of the brain is underactivated when you have less than 6 hours of sleep at night. Or this area of the brain is unable to do its job as efficiently. And the red areas are areas that are more activated, sort of midbrain regions that are associated with basic impulses and instincts. So when you're getting less than 6 hours of sleep a night, your brain is actually unable to recruit the systems of the brain that you need to be that better version of yourself. This area of the brain, I love this image because it's like, here's where the balance is weighed. Do I want the weight loss or do I want the chocolate bar? And this area of the brain right here is basically keeping track of your goals. And it's sort of a hard job, it's heavy lifting it needs to do, is to remember long-term goals, core values, and when it is unable to do that, when it's underfueled or when it's underactive, your brain thinks all you really want is the chocolate bar, or to procrastinate, or to follow that link through, or to not bother doing your yoga exercises. And so in some key way, the ability to remember who you are and what your big goals are is dependent on the ability of this area of the brain to use energy well, and sleep deprivation is one of the main things that can get in the way of that. And I think that's one of the reasons why this small sleep intervention ended up helping people resist relapse to drug addiction, because they now had brains that were better fueled to remember their goals to stay clean and sober. And it's not just sleep that impacts the physiology of your brain, how well your brain uses energy. There are a couple of other things that seem to really strengthen the ability of the brain's frontal regions to do what they're supposed to do, to help you control impulses and find your motivation. And here are the 4 things from the research that seem to do it, to make your brain a kind of willpower machine. One is sleep, as I mentioned, and hopefully there's going to be one thing on this list that you're not currently doing that you're willing to do, because you don't have to do all 4. So getting a little bit more sleep really makes the prefrontal cortex better able to regulate those systems of the brain that direct you towards temptation and immediate gratification. And meditation also. And both meditation and physical exercise have been shown not only to make your brain more efficient at using these self-control systems, but they actually make these systems bigger and better connected to the regions that they are supposed to be controlling. And again, it can be a very quick time course to see these benefits. People who meditate maybe 10 minutes a day, after a couple of months, their brains look different. These regions are bigger and better connected. People who work out on a regular basis who used to be sedentary, again, studies show that in as little as a couple of months of regular workouts, their prefrontal cortices are bigger and denser and better connected. And so these are 2 of the things you can do that actually train the physiology of your willpower. And the last thing that the research suggests is what you eat has a very big influence on whether or not your brain is able to be this better version of yourself. There's something about having big spikes in blood sugar levels and then big drops in blood sugar levels that really screws up how the brain uses energy. And you need your brain to be like an energy efficient machine if you're going to be walking around the world in that kind of better you mindset rather than that kind of basic impulse you. And so research shows that shifting to eating a more plant-based diet actually changes the way the brain functions and has a lot to do with what's going on with your blood sugar levels. And so these are all things that we sometimes think of as requiring willpower, right? We think, okay, I have to sit down and force myself to meditate. I have to work out. I have to say no to the donut and eat something, that has fiber in it for breakfast. But we rarely think about the fact that actually not doing these things may be part of what makes it so difficult to begin. And there's a kind of a curve where when we first start, it feels like we're using willpower. But everything on this list that takes a little bit of willpower to begin with ends up giving you back far more willpower than they take. And not just for these challenges. It's not just that exercising makes it easier to exercise. Studies show that exercising makes it easier to eat right, to not spend too much money, to stop procrastinating, to pay better attention. All of these things have a kind of global training effect on what you could think of as your willpower muscle. Was there a question up front or a comment? So the question is, why does it say low glycemic and plant-based? There's actually more evidence that a vegan diet does this better than a diet that is low glycemic and includes animal products, but I'm not sure that that's entirely realistic for everyone. So I think you can kind of pick which way you're willing to go with that. Both low glycemic and plant-based help. But if you look at just the physiology of it, there's more evidence for the plant-based diet. Okay. So let me go on to the next experiment. So the first experiment was just get some more sleep. Second experiment, I want you to think about a recent setback you had or a kind of a willpower failure. Maybe it was not eating the healthy thing at lunch. Maybe it was not doing your exercise in the morning. Maybe it was spending all morning long following links that had nothing to do with your project. Okay, so I want you to think of a recent time when you had some kind of willpower failure. Does anyone need to borrow one of mine? You guys got one? Okay. So my question for you is, do you think that feeling bad about that, presumably feeling maybe a little bit of regret, a little bit of guilt about it, a little bit of self-criticism about that, does that help us improve next time? Can that be a real source of future willpower? Raise your hand if you think that feeling bad can actually be a real source of willpower to improve next time. Hands up. And how many of you think that that feeling bad is actually going to be a further drain on willpower? Yeah, great. Maybe some of you have read that chapter in the book. So I want to talk now about some of the research that tends to surprise people the most. When I first started teaching this class, this was the research people argued with. Like literally I couldn't get them to be quiet in the classroom because they were so convinced this couldn't possibly be true. This is a study looking at whether it's better to let yourself off the hook for your mistakes in terms of preventing future willpower collapses. And so this particular study I'm going to talk about in a little more detail brought in people who were trying to manage their weight and eat healthy. And they gave them an immediate willpower failure. They showed up for the study and they were forced to eat a donut. And they even had to choose the flavor of donut they were going to eat so they would feel really complicit in this willpower failure. And they had to drink a whole glass of water too so they'd feel a little bit uncomfortably full. Okay, so we have everyone, dieters here, having now a willpower failure. They just ate this donut. And the next part of the study is a taste test where they're given a lot of different types of candy and they're said, you know, we want you to evaluate all of these candies, so please just eat as much as you need to, as much as you want, so that you can evaluate these candies. And of course, these candies were all pre-weighed, so that experimenters could find out exactly how much candy the dieters ate after they had blown their diet with a donut. And in this particular study, the researchers had a hypothesis. They thought that the guilt that dieters experience when they fall off their diet actually really undermines future self-control. And so they wanted to create an intervention that would basically get rid of the guilt and shame that people feel when they make a mistake. And so in this study, half of the dieters were randomly assigned to receive a special letting themselves off the hook message. So between the donut eating and the taste test, an experimenter came in and said something very simple. They said, by the way, we've realized now that some people in this experiment feel guilty after eating the donut. Okay? So there was an opportunity for people to recognize they might be feeling guilty. Second part of the message, we want you to remember that actually everyone indulges sometimes, and we ask you to do it. So there's a kind of putting it in a broader perspective. And the last part of the message was a simple plea. Please don't be too hard on yourself about it. Okay, so very simple. You might be feeling guilty. Remember, everyone does it. Don't be hard on yourself about it. And then they went on to the taste test. And what the researchers found was that the women who had been given the self-forgiveness message ate less than half as much candy as women who had not been told, don't worry about it, it's not a big deal. Which is exactly the opposite of what most people think. Most people think you make a mistake, you have a willpower failure, and you start saying nice things to yourself about it, that this could only lead to disaster. That would lead to licensing even more indulgence. And yet, that's exactly the opposite of what was found in this study, and not just this study, but in a lot of different studies now. This is one of the sort of the strongest pieces of theory we have in willpower research right now. That is, the harder you are on yourself when you have a willpower failure, the more likely you are to have the same failure again, and the bigger it's going to be when you do. For example, one study took a look at problem drinkers and had them keep track of how much they were drinking and how bad they felt the morning after. What they found is that the people who were the most self-critical and felt the most ashamed or guilty about drinking the night before wanted to drink more immediately when they woke up, and also drank more that night and the next. There was something about the self-critical nature, the shame and the guilt, that was driving people back to the very thing they felt bad about. Same has been shown for addictions, including quitting smoking. You know, you have that first relapse, and the more you beat yourself up about it, the more you now need to be comforted with something, probably the very thing that you're feeling bad about, because that's probably why you do it in the first place. Same has been shown for gambling. The more people feel guilty and self-critical about losing money, the more likely they are to borrow money and try to win it back and end up losing more. And even for procrastination, so you may not have any kind of addictions, but even for procrastination, research shows that the harder someone is on themselves for putting something off, the longer they procrastinate the next time. And all of this has to do with the basic fact that when we are feeling stressed out and guilty and ashamed, that is a state that puts us into the version of ourselves, the mindset, that is much more susceptible to immediate gratification, temptation, and anxiety. It's basically the biological opposite of what needs to be happening in your brain and body to remember your long-term goals and to be that other version of yourself, what we would call the willpower version of yourself. And as soon as you start piling on the guilt and the shame, your brain switches into that other mode in which now everything's going to be more tempting, including procrastinating or including smoking or drinking. So I just wanted to give you a sense of what it would be like to give yourself a self-compassion message. Again, I said this was a tiny intervention, this donut study. And this is basically all it was. And there are a number of programs now that are teaching people how to write these messages for themselves and to literally have them scripted for the moment they fail. For the moment that they procrastinated and they're late again, or for the moment they had that cigarette when they hadn't smoked in a week, and to be able to whip this message out as a way of not falling down that hole that we often fall into. So the 3 steps of this message is, the first is mindfulness of what you're thinking and feeling. Noticing that you're feeling guilty, or noticing that you're feeling self-doubt or self-critical, maybe angry at yourself, and actually allow yourself to see those feelings. Because a big reason that people go from feeling guilty to giving in again is that they just want to get rid of that feeling. It's so kind of overwhelming, and they want to distract themselves from it with something that is going to get them into further trouble. And then the second step is this common humanity. One of the reasons that it is hard to find our motivation and our willpower is we start to feel like there's something uniquely broken with us. There's something about who we are that is wrong and weak. And that mindset makes it very difficult to tap back into your motivation or your strength. And so this message of common humanity is basically saying to yourself, you know what? This is part of the process of change. This is how things get done. Sometimes we procrastinate. Sometimes we fall off the wagon. Everyone is imperfect. And to recognize that this is not saying anything about who you are. It's saying something about the process. And what matters is how you respond afterward, not the fact that it happened at all. And then this last step is encouragement over criticism. And if you were to think about someone you were mentoring, you know, some of you probably have mentees here, or interns, or you think about a child that you care about, or a dear friend, what would you say to them when they had a setback? And to say that to yourself, it might be reminding yourself of your goal. It might be reminding yourself of the big picture rather than the sort of the micro picture in which you feel like a failure. And to do that rather than the voices we often have in our head that are saying things like, oh, why did you do that again? You're so stupid. You're never going to change. And to actually start to talk to yourself a little bit in the second person as if you were a good friend. And research shows that this particular approach, learning how to talk to yourself in this way, is more effective, for example, at quitting smoking than nicotine replacement therapy. That's how powerful being able to respond to setbacks with self-compassion can be. I want you to take a look at these circles, which go from being totally non-overlapping to extremely overlapping. And you're going to decide which of these sets of circles best represents how you feel about who you are today and who you're going to be, let's say, 30 years from now, 30 years in the future. Or pick a time period that feels right to you. Okay, so this is your current self, and this is your future self 30 years from now. This means who you are today is really very different than who you're going to be 30 years from now. Some overlap, but actually a lot of change is going to be happening between now, who knows. And then this last set of circles, this is like, you know what, who I am today is probably who I'm going to be in 30 years. Same me. Okay, so you're going to pick for yourself, take another few seconds and think where you are on this graph. Actually, let's do like a kind of rolling wave, because I'm actually curious if there's a trend being here at Google. So just put your hand up when you see your circle highlighted. Who's over here? Who's over here? Over here? Okay. Over here? Oh, you guys are normally distributed. This is great. Who's over here? Who's over here? And who's over here? Yeah, pretty good, pretty good. Oh, that was great. Okay, so it turns out where you put yourself on this map has a lot to do with some very important willpower challenges related to health and money and even moral behavior. Don't feel too bad if you're at an extreme tail that is not associated with willpower, because I'm going to show you some strategies for being able to get to the end that is associated with willpower if you need it. Okay, so let me start with the first intervention, and this was an intervention that, that was done here at Stanford University. And this was using undergraduate students who are very young, and it was a virtual reality experiment where undergraduate students came into the laboratory, and the researchers had carefully created 3D avatars of the student themselves. So if I came into the laboratory, I would be meeting a 3D avatar of myself at retirement age. And it was a really great setup in which you got all the virtual reality equipment on, hearing and seeing, and it feels like you are sitting across the table from your future self. And it's set up with cameras in such a way so that if I move my left hand like this, it looks like my future self is also moving their hand. And if I talk, it looks like my future self is talking back. And in the study, the college students were invited to interview their future selves, to say things like, hey, future Kelly, what's going on right now? What's really important in your life right now? And then they had to answer the question. And so they would see I would see future Kelly describing what's important in my life at retirement age. And this went on for about an hour, getting to know their future selves. And the reason that the researchers decided to do this intervention is because they had discovered that most of us feel like our future self is a stranger. And all of you who are on that first half of the distribution sort of think like you're thinking about the future self and you don't really know who that is. They could be really an improvement on this model, or it could just be an older version of this model. We don't know. But what researchers found is that the more you feel like your future self is a stranger, is different than you, the less likely you are to do things to protect that future self's health and happiness. Because why would you bother saving money for some stranger when you could spend it today on someone you know and love? So in this particular experiment, after they had gotten to know their future self, there was some time elapsed because they didn't want it to be totally obvious what was going on. There's some time elapsed, and they brought people back and had them divvy up $1,000 in a budgeting task. And they pretended like they were interested in how people make budgeting decisions. But what they found is that the college students who had met and interacted with their future self ended up allotting more than twice as much money into a retirement account than college students who had not met their future self. College students who had not met their future self were much more likely to want to allot that money to their present expenses or to some fun splurge. And this research has actually had a lot of impact in the world of retirement savings and banking. I just heard an economist recommend last week that we should be trying to Photoshop pictures of people's future self on every mortgage application or credit card application, so people would have to really think about the implications of this. I mean, you could imagine an HR setting, right, where people are new employee and they're asked to make their retirement allocations. What if they had to interact with their future self first? New college students coming into a first job might make a very big difference in their retirement savings down the line. Okay, so that was just that was the intervention, that was the experiment, but I just want to point more broadly to some of the research looking at that circle graph that I showed you. And it turns out that people who believe that there is more overlap, that they are more closely related to their future self, have a lot more willpower for different types of willpower challenges. Oops, didn't mean to do that. So the first thing is they're less likely to procrastinate in general and less likely to be late. I mean, one of my favorite findings from this research is that people who felt like they were less similar to their future self were also more likely to show up late for the experiment or skip it completely, to just blow it off. And that was a kind of interesting finding. They also are more comfortable, are more likely to make ethical decisions at work. So people who think that the future self is more different, like a total stranger, they're actually more likely to feel good about betraying a colleague at work if it helps them advance in their career. They're more likely to keep money that they found even when they might have an inkling who that money belongs to. And that's kind of an interesting finding, because we could understand retirement, future self, but it seems like this ability to disconnect from the long-term consequences of your choices actually primes you to be that more impulsive self, even when it doesn't really have anything to do with your own long-term benefits. And then also looking at real-world outcomes, not just an experiment, but you look at what circle people choose and how much money they have, their assets, their home, their debt, their wealth. And people who feel closer to their future self actually have more assets, are more likely to own their home outright, more money in the bank, more retirement savings. And so this is a real-world finding, not just an experiment. And they're also more likely to do things that don't have a payoff immediately, like flossing and exercising, but that will be good to protect their future self. So with that in mind, one of my favorite willpower boosting strategies that you can do that doesn't really take any willpower at all is to get to know your future self. And there are, you actually here maybe you can do 3D avatars. Is that like a Google project somewhere? Can't tell you. But so most people can actually interact with their future self in that high-tech a way. But it seems like there are other ways that work as well. And one is to write a letter from your future self to your present self. And you can do this in a number of different ways. So one way is to just write to your present self about who you are, what you're doing, where you're living, what you care about. Or you could even write a more closely defined letter that looks at some challenge you're dealing with now. Maybe you're struggling to quit some addiction, or spend time with your family, or it's just something that it seems like it's not working the way you would like it to. And you could write a letter from your future self thanking your present self for doing it and describing what it was you did and why it mattered. And research suggests that this kind of letter writing from your future self can actually give yourself more willpower. Yes?
Is this boomerang if you actually have low self-esteem now? Telling yourself that you're going to be more like you are now in the future. If you're a loser, you'll always be a loser.
That is probably not the letter you should write. So just for people who are watching this on the video, the question was, if you feel really bad about yourself now, could this have the opposite effect, where you think, oh my God, I'm never going to change, and if you're a loser now, you're going to always be a loser. So the letter might be like, dear loser, I'm still a loser. You're still a loser. Life sucks. That is not the letter. Actually, so research suggests it is better to be optimistic in this letter than to be pessimistic. But at the same time, the key thing about this finding is not so much whether you think you are going to be exactly the same, but whether you understand that it's going to be the same person having the future experience. And that, which actually comes to the second point here. And so that's actually a different thing. It's not like, are you still going to have all of the same problems and all of the same neuroses, or have you fixed them? It's not that kind of same self, different self. It's, do you understand that, like, how real pain is right now? If I were to come and punch you, how much that would hurt? Do you understand that 30 years from now, it's going to hurt if someone punches you? And that seems to be the thing that people actually have problems with. When they think about their future selves, they don't have access to those emotions. They don't understand that future happiness is going to be as real and as important. And so, so when you're doing this kind of letter writing or doing this future self imagination, the actual critical part is getting to feel like that future self is real and that it is in some way you, that you are going to be the one having this experience. And it's not so much whether you think you're going to be the identical person still listening to the same music you listened to in 1983, or it's not like that. Okay, so here's the second future self exercise, which kind of gets to that. And I call this going back to the future. And this is the exercise of just imagining yourself in the future. Studies show that just imagining yourself grocery shopping in the future, okay, not anything even relevant to your goals, but just grocery shopping, then ends up helping people make better decisions in the present moment that's going to lead to payoff in the future. Because you can actually imagine it, and you can imagine what would be on the shelf, and you know what it feels like to be pushing a shopping cart. And there's something about making the future real that gives us more willpower, kind of independent of the content, what you're thinking about. But there's also studies showing that you can imagine specific futures related to your willpower challenge, and both good sort of future realities and negative future realities can be very motivating. So in one study, they had people who wanted to improve their health to imagine the consequences of not making a change, like really vividly. What's that going to be like? What's it going to feel like 10 years from now if you don't make this change? And they had another group think about the positive consequences of making the change, and what would that be like, and how are you going to feel? And both of those sort of future thinking ended up increasing the good health behavior in the present. And so you guys have seen Back to the Future 2, right? Have you guys seen Back to the Future 2? You know, he goes into the future, and there's like a really bad future and a really good future. Okay, at some point that reference is not going to work anymore. That is. Okay, here's, so we got 2 more interventions. In this next intervention, I just want to take a poll. So we're talking about visualizing things. If you had to guess which would be more helpful for finding your willpower, do you think it's more helpful to imagine or visualize yourself failing, or is it more helpful to visualize and imagine yourself succeeding? Raise your hand if you think imagining failure is going to be more helpful. Raise your hand if you think imagining success. You guys are such typical Americans. Okay, that's what everyone thinks. So actually it turns out imagining failure is way more helpful than imagining success. Not that imagining success is always bad, but imagining failure is better. So let me tell you about this one intervention and then some of the theory a little bit more broadly. In this particular study, they took women from young adult to middle age, a little bit older adults, all of whom were not exercising at all, and all of whom had the goal to exercise. And some of those women were randomly assigned to your typical, it's good to exercise, here's why you should exercise, now think about your goal and imagine yourself doing it, very typical. And the other half were randomly assigned to what they called an obstacle condition, where they had to imagine themselves failing. They had to ask themselves, when are you going to not exercise? What is the obstacle going to be? When is it going to happen? What are you going to do if that happens? And they had people write about that every single day. They had to write out, when are you going to not exercise? What are you going to say to yourself that allows you not to exercise? When's it going to happen? How's it going to happen? And what are you going to do when you start to recognize that stuff happening? And so the women were becoming kind of detectives of their own failure. And every day they revised what they were writing based on what they noticed. I didn't exercise because I told myself, I'll do it later, I'll do it later, I'll do it later. Now it's time to go to sleep. Or I didn't do it because I got so busy at work and then I didn't have my sneakers, so I didn't do it. And they became very clear about how they fail. And they were able to predict future failures from that. And here's what the results were. It had an immediate effect of doubling the amount of time they were exercising. So the very first week they started to predict their failure in this way, they doubled to 102 minutes of exercise a week. And that's getting pretty close to the amount of exercise that you need to have very serious health benefits, both mental health and physical health. There was a much smaller improvement here in the group of women who were given the standard, you want to exercise, exercise is great, let's do it. And 16 weeks, so 4 months after that study, the women who had been predicting their failure had maintained and were exercising twice as much as the women who were in the basic, let's exercise, here's why it's good. So this is the thing that always blows people's minds. There is a lot of studies showing that tracking your success leads people to slack off in the long run, but nobody believes it. So you've probably heard how important it is to keep track of your success, because we feel really good when we're able to write down that we did something, right? You know you feel really good. You're like, yes, check it off. Some people make to-do lists just so they can check stuff off. And we know how good we feel when we're able to write down and record our successes. And we mistake that feeling good as motivation to do more. But a number of studies show that when people are reminded of their success and take note of their progress, they then are much more likely to do something inconsistent with their goal. So if somebody, so for example, there's studies of dieters where people come in and the experimenter says, by the way, we wanted to let you know how much progress you've made on losing weight. You're this close to your goal. You've been doing great. And on the way out of the lab, would you like a chocolate bar? And women are much more likely to take the chocolate bar if they were reminded of their success. The same study's been shown for procrastination. You have people keep track and feel good about the progress that they've made on a task, and they're much more likely to choose not to work on it. And this is the goal switching hypothesis. The idea is that any willpower challenge is a competition between these two versions of yourself, and they're both you. And as soon as your mind realizes that one of you is satisfied because you made some progress, the other goal becomes primed in your brain, and it becomes more appealing. So I don't want to say don't keep track of your success, because I think what I really want to encourage you to do is both. But let me point to a couple of other ideas along this line. Okay, so about why pessimism can be so helpful, because it's profoundly un-American to be pessimistic when you have a goal. And I just want to encourage you to think about using pessimism as actually a source of willpower. So there's this kind of finding floating around that people who are most optimistic about their ability to make a difficult change give up sooner and are most likely to fail. And it tends to be because they are shocked by their setbacks. And so one of the ways that predicting failure can be helpful is that when it happens, it's not like some shock to your system where you can't believe it happened, it must say something bad about who you are or about your likelihood of success in the future. There's also interesting studies, as I mentioned, that optimism, well, this is both progress and optimism, but studies show that if you have people make optimistic predictions about what they're going to do, they're more likely to then not do it today. So people who intend to exercise tomorrow are more likely to eat something unhealthy today and skip the gym. And even just having people think about what they're going to do in their future makes people more likely to make a different choice today. And so just knowing that you're going to be just as tempted tomorrow, you're going to be just as busy tomorrow, just as stressed out tomorrow, turns out to be an important source of willpower today. Okay, and then this, I just had to throw this in because I think this is one of the funniest findings in the willpower research, that 75% of corporations that are investigated by the SEC for fraud can be tracked back to initial optimism that then people were unwilling to let go of. They were so optimistic about their profit projections, that when they met their first setback, they didn't know what to do and they started to fudge the numbers. And this is something that we all do with our own goals when we set very high ideals and then refuse to adjust our expectations based on reality. And this is something I run into a lot at Stanford. People say they want to make big change or they have a big goal in mind. And they aren't the least bit interested in setting a small goal or a baby step, because like, how is that going to ever get me where I want? So let's go big or go